We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. With this institution of protections for all citizens, the Founding Fathers created a nation built upon autonomy and egalitarianism. Nevertheless, Executive Order 9066 was ratified on February 19, 1942, endangering those ideologies and creating a conflict whose impact would resonate throughout generations of citizens. The executive order's divisiveness would imperil any notions of citizenry and test the foundation of we the people by creating one of the biggest compromises of American civil liberties due to the federal government succumbing to an irrational fear of espionage during wartime hysteria. This fear would ultimately decide the mass evacuation of thousands of innocent people comprised of immigrants and citizens who were forced from their homes into internment camps that not only compromised their rights as citizens but as human beings. The strife of thousands of innocent lives, the battle of Japanese-American internment. In the mid-19th century, Japanese immigrants known as Issei began arriving along the west coast of the United States. As first-generation Japanese Americans, Issei had to establish themselves and their families in local communities. For decades, Issei faced racial harassment from other citizens who clamored that Issei threaten local economy. Due to their success in industries like farming, in 1913 the California Alien Land Law was passed. This document prohibited all aliens from purchasing land but was targeted at Issei. The Immigration Act of 1924 was later passed and followed in its targeting of Asian communities by preventing any Asian immigrants from entering the country. The Land Law and Immigration Act were one of many written thefts of Japanese American rights and will build upon the substantial anti-Asian sentiment in the nation, laying a strong foundation for decades of irrational conflict and one-sided compromise between America and its Japanese American citizens. However, the legal restrictions became comparable to an afterthought. Japanese Americans were treated with overwhelming amounts of racism, surrounded by neighbors who made life a chaotic mixture of federal and social exclusion. Issei could not defend themselves against any of the accumulating restraints. They were ineligible for citizenship and remained powerless as their lives began to splinter into tumultuous fragments of humiliation, stigmatism, and an endless stream of laws that would further compromise the legal rights of even their children, Issei. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces bombed the Hawaiian naval base at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. Over 300 Japanese planes bombarded the naval base. For all Americans, especially Japanese Americans, this event was disastrous. It turned the country in the direction of internment. As war was declared with Japan on December 8, 1941, terror seized Japanese American families. Mass exclusion then seemed like the only option for both military and political reasons. Citizens were restless and demanded action from President Franklin Roosevelt. Knowing that Pearl Harbor deeply affected Canada as well, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister of Canada Mackenzie King, through the Permanent Joint Board of Defense, an advisory body for the military safety of North America, collaborated on the unanimous desire to mass exclude the Japanese population in both countries.
Clearly there had been coordination. We knew there was going to be action taken by both governments. They did it in different ways, but they achieved the same effect.
Having come to a conclusion on February 19, 1942, the infamous Executive Order 9066 was signed by the President 8 days after he had ordered the War Department to plan the evacuation of Japanese Americans. Included in the order was the potential for military areas to be established anywhere in the nation, and the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus for all citizens, an indefinite suspension of their constitutional rights. However, the suspension was only taken advantage of in the case of Japanese Americans. By the suspension, internment could begin, externally ceasing the ongoing conflict between Japanese Americans and other citizens. However, for Japanese Americans, a new conflict would arise, a 4-year struggle of enduring hardships and peremptory internment camps that compromised their rights as human beings. By March 2, 1942, 2 military areas had been established by General John L. DeWitt. For most residing in these areas, internment was a superlative decision, but for Japanese Americans, it portended the extirpation of their community that had so painstakingly established themselves in the land of the free. Executive Order 9102, the document establishing the War Relocation Authority, was ratified on March 18, 1942, furthering the finality of internment. The department had the power to relocate whoever they believed Executive Order 9066 applied to. Invariably, the power was used to remove Japanese American men accused of treason from their homes, leaving their families to fend for themselves until they too were inevitably removed. Japanese Americans were given 27 days to uproot their lives and voluntarily evacuate Military Area 1. Only two options were available: move eastward, where rejection to be let through state borders was highly likely, or to be forced behind barbed wire into internment camps that were still being assembled. March 29, 1942 was the day that no options remained. Voluntary evacuation was declared over. Forceful evacuation was put in effect, making internment the only option for this community that had all been classified as enemy alien, despite the fact that 2/3 of Japanese Americans, all Nisei, were natural-born citizens. Internees were first moved to assembly centers, which were usually old stadiums or racetracks, and were abound with disease. Internees could only take a few of their possessions with them.
I had to leave all the furniture, cooking utensils, painting, books, you name it, the dishes, everything you see in your own house. If you were to leave, you have 2 arms, you could carry 2 suitcases.
Months passed until the first internment camp was opened, Manzanar. 9 others existed: Tule Lake, California; Jerome, Arkansas; Minidoka, Idaho; Gila River, Arizona; Heart Mountain, Wyoming; Granada, Colorado; Poston, Arizona; Rower, Arkansas; and Topaz, Utah. Many of the camps were still being assembled upon the arrival of Japanese Americans, making the conditions there scarcely an enhancement from the poor conditions of the assembly centers. Internees were also granted little to no privacy. To a certain degree, though, life in the camps had some similarities with life outside. Adults could receive work leave from the camps, provided that anyone would hire them. Children were offered schooling within the camps, yet the quality of this education was highly varied. The camps became communities, with churches, dance classes, and even baseball leagues. But these frivolities do not change the fact that tens of thousands of rightful Americans were forced from their homes and stripped of the constitutional protections due to them. The internment camps had been purposefully placed in areas of isolation from the rest of society to avoid conflict with other American citizens. This achieved the desired goal of mass exclusion, as the focus of the general American populace was then on the war. Despite this isolation, Japanese Americans were still thoroughly involved in the Second World War. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, comprised solely of Nisei men, became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. Even when behind barbed wire, Japanese Americans devoted themselves to the United States. The war ended on September 2, 1945, with the surrender of Japan. However, for Japanese Americans, the nightmare they had endured for years now had yet to cease. Granada was the first post-war camp to close, 43 days after the war had ended. Tule Lake closed last, 199 days after the war had ended. Many Japanese Americans had lost almost everything, such as their jobs, their businesses, and their homes.
My family came back home to California, where we were from, when we had living there for 40 or 50 years, so we had a lot of old friends that we already knew. And it was interesting because you hear about how immigrants are today. Well, we were kind of like an immigrant.
Japanese Americans had to rebuild their community from the ground up, an effort that would cause economic distress for decades. 23,000 internees filed for redress, but only 137 cases were approved. Fortunately, most internees would go on to restore the wealth that they had obtained prior to internment. The federal apology by the government for internment was issued in 1988, over 100 years after Issei had arrived in a nation that had done anything but welcome them, and 42 years after internment had ended. Only Nisei could read the apology upon it being issued. Most, if not all, Issei had passed away. To provide for the common defense, the United States betrayed a community dedicated to the welfare and success of the nation. In a time of warfare, an irrational fear gripped the country and led to 110,000 people being forced behind barbed wire. The preamble of the Constitution states, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice." But in no way was justice provided for Japanese Americans. The egalitarianism that seemed to be ever present was never present for Issei, who were constantly vying for citizenship that was rightfully theirs. nor for Nisei, who were underclass 4C enemy alien despite being born American citizens. The decisions made by the federal government would prove to have lasting effects on Japanese Americans, making internment the compromise of human rights due to a conflict forged by an irrational fear.